Imagine this. Your own bedroom, the place you should feel safest. And now picture it transformed into, well, a scene of just unbelievable violence.
Yeah.
That's where we're starting today, in a house in Lexington, North Carolina, August 2015. From the outside, just a normal family home.
But inside,
Mm.
something horrific happened that night. Jason Corbett, the man living there, was found dead, killed in a really brutal way.
Uh-huh. It shocked even the first responders who arrived on scene.
Yeah, the descriptions from the sources are stark. The bedroom, significant blood on the floor, the walls.
And the details from the EMS crew.
Right. They noted really severe head trauma, back of the head. One paramedic, mentioned his fingers actually went inside Jason's skull.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, said his right hand felt mushy. They saw dried blood, too, gelled blood in an eye socket, suggesting some time had passed.
And there's something else found nearby.
A brick, or like a cement paver stone, on the floor, near a lamp that had been knocked over.
Just trying to visualize that. It's deeply disturbing. So this deep dive, it's about this case. The killing of Jason Corbett.
And the conviction of his wife, Molly Martens, and her father, Thomas Martens.
But then that conviction was overturned on appeal,
Yeah.
which was pretty stunning.
Right. And that led to a plea deal recently, and now they've been released.
So it's a really complex story with a lot of twists.
And we've gathered quite a bit of material for this, news reports from the time, court documents, which are really detailed, plus newer info from things like that Netflix documentary, and a book by Jason's daughter, Sarah.
Right. So our goal here is to really walk through all these sources, pull out the key details, look at the very different stories told about that night,
Examine the evidence that was presented.
and trace the whole legal journey. It took some unexpected turns. Hopefully by the end, you'll have a clearer picture of what the sources tell us about this whole tragic situation.
Okay, so where do we start? Maybe with Jason Corbett himself. Before all this happened.
Good idea. So the sources tell us Jason Corbett was an Irish businessman, seemed successful, but his life had already seen tragedy. His first wife, Margaret, people called her Mags. She died back in 2006.
And the cause of death there is actually quite important, isn't it?
Yeah,
Because it came up later.
it did. But the sources we looked at are very clear on this point. Mags's death was due to an acute cardiorespiratory attack, natural causes.
Confirmed by an autopsy, confirmed by her own family. Not suspicious at the time.
Right. So Jason was left a widower with two very young children. Jack was, what, 3?
3, yeah. And Sarah was just 1 year old.
So incredibly difficult situation for him, raising these 2 little kids alone.
Absolutely. Which leads us to how Molly Martens came into the picture.
Okay, how did that happen?
Well, Jason needed help. He hired Molly, who was a young American woman back in 2008. She came over to Ireland to work as a live-in nanny for Jack and Sarah.
Okay, a live-in nanny.
Yeah, reports suggest she was maybe looking for a fresh start or something.
Obviously, their relationship changed from employer-employee.
It did. Sources say a romantic relationship developed between Jason and Molly. They eventually got married in 2011.
And after they married.
They moved. Jason, Molly, and the 2 children relocated from Ireland to North Carolina. Settled in Lexington, actually near where Molly's parents live.
Right near her parents, Tom and Sharon Martens.
Exactly. And that's where they were living in August 2015 when everything happened.
Which brings us back to that horrifying scene the first responders walked into. You mentioned the blood, the brick. What else did the physical evidence tell investigators? What about the weapons?
The sources identified 2 main weapons used in the attack. That baseball bat and the brick or paver stone we mentioned.
And the state of Jason's body suggested they weren't just used once or twice?
No, far from it. The evidence pointed to extreme brutality, repeatedly used.
The expert testimony must have been absolutely critical here, like the bloodstain pattern analysis, trying to piece together how it happened.
Hugely important. The sources really emphasized the testimony of Stuart James, the bloodstain pattern analyst. His findings suggested the attack wasn't static, it moved.
How so?
Well, he found blood spatters inside the quilt and on the mattress itself, which led him to suggest, that the very first blows might have struck Jason while he was still in bed.
Still in bed. So potentially attacked while he was asleep? Or just waking up?
That's what those particular spatters implied, according to James's testimony and the sources. But it didn't stop there.
Okay.
He also found spatter patterns on the walls that indicated more blows were struck as Jason was falling, or perhaps already lowered down. And maybe the most critical finding, sources point to blood spatter found on the inside hem of Thomas Martens' boxer shorts.
Inside the hem?
Yeah. And the direction of that spatter, James testified, indicated that blows were being struck while Jason's head was already very low. likely on or near the floor.
Hitting him while he was already down. That detail really paints a picture of the violence continuing.
It does. It speaks to the level of force, and importantly, when it was applied during the incident.
Anything else from the bloodstain analysis?
Yes, something quite strange. James noted blood drips on a vacuum cleaner in the room.
Okay.
But the direction of the drips seemed to defy physics, defy gravity, based on where the vacuum was when police photographed the scene.
What does that mean?
His testimony suggested this could mean the crime scene had been altered. Things potentially moved around after the blood was shed, but before the police took their official photos.
Altering a crime scene? That obviously raises huge questions about what really happened versus the story they told later.
Exactly. It casts immediate doubt.
Let's turn to the medical examiner's findings. What did the autopsy reveal about the injuries themselves?
Dr. Craig Nelson performed the autopsy. His conclusion was blunt force head trauma as the cause of death, and he ruled it a homicide.
And the details of that trauma.
They're shocking, frankly, as reported in the sources. He documented a minimum of 12 distinct blows to Jason's head.
12. Minimum.
Yes, across 10 different impact areas. So some areas were hit multiple times. He described 2 large lacerations on the back of the head from these repeated blows.
The severity.
Dr. Nilsson actually compared the skull fractures to the kind of injuries you'd see from someone falling from a great height or in a serious car crash. That's how severe they were.
Wow. Just devastating force.
And perhaps one of the most chilling findings from the autopsy, highlighted in the sources.
What was that?
Dr. Nelson determined that at least one of those 12 blows occurred after Jason was already dead.
A post-mortem blow.
Yeah.
If that's the case, it completely destroys any argument that the force only lasted as long as a perceived threat existed.
Precisely. That post-mortem injury became a key piece of evidence for the prosecution, countering the self-defense narrative.
Were there other injuries noted?
Yes. Sources mention a broken nose, bruising under his right eye and on the back of his left hand, and some blunt force injuries on his right thigh as well.
Okay. What about toxicology? Did that play a role? There were claims later about him being drunk.
Right. The toxicology report is important here. It showed Jason had a blood alcohol level of just 0.02%.
0.02, that's well below the legal limit to drive.
Exactly. It directly contradicted defense claims that Jason was out of control drunk that night. He also had a low level of trazodone, which is an antidepressant sometimes used as a sedative, but again, a low therapeutic level.
So, putting it all together, the crime scene, the bloodstains suggesting movement and blows while down, the sheer number and severity of injuries, the post-mortem blow, the minimal alcohol, it points to an incredibly violent, sustained attack.
That's the picture the physical and forensic evidence painted, according to the sources.
Okay, but Molly and Tom Martens told a very different story. Their narrative was self-defense. Let's unpack their version of events.
Right. Their account comes mainly from Tom Martens' 911 call, Molly's written statement given to police later that morning, and then Tom's testimony at the trial.
Let's start with the 911 call. What did Tom say right at the beginning?
He called 911 and told the operator something like, "My son-in-law got in a fight with my daughter." He said he intervened.
Okay.
And he said Jason was in bad shape. He actually said, "I may have killed him."
I may have killed him right from the start. What about Molly's statement? What was her explanation?
Sources detail her written statement. She claimed Jason woke up angry, they argued, and then he started choking her.
Choking her?
Twice, she claimed. She said she screamed, he covered her mouth, then choked her again. At that point, she said, her father came into the room and hit Jason.
And the weapons, how did they come into play in her account?
She claimed Jason grabbed the bat at some point. And she said she tried to hit Jason with a brick. A brick she claimed was on her nightstand.
The brick again? On the nightstand? That detail comes up early.
It does. Now, Tom Martens gave a much more detailed account during his trial testimony.
What did he testify to? Walk us through his version.
Okay, so according to sources detailing his testimony, Tom said he and his wife were visiting, staying downstairs. He heard a commotion, sounds of a struggle, and a scream from upstairs.
So he went to investigate?
Yes. He said he grabbed a baseball bat, one he had apparently brought with him on the visit for the kids, he said, and went upstairs.
Okay, he already had the bat with him.
Yes. He claimed when he got to their bedroom door, he saw Jason with his hands around Molly's neck.
He saw Jason choking Molly.
That's what he claimed. He said he entered the room, closed the door behind him, which is an interesting detail, and told Jason, "Let her go."
And Jason's response, according to Tom?
Tom testified. Jason said, "I'm going to kill her," and repeated it. He claimed Jason then shifted his grip, holding Molly in the crook of his arm.
Okay.
Tom said he feared Jason was going to drag Molly into the adjoining bathroom. So that's when he claimed he first hit Jason with the bat on the back of the head.
And what happened then in his telling?
He said Jason didn't go down after the first hit. He claimed Jason was still holding Molly, so he hit him more times. He described them moving, possibly ending up briefly in the bathroom where he hit Jason twice more.
Still hitting him.
Then back in the bedroom, he claimed Jason somehow managed to grab the bat away from him.
Jason got the bat.
In Tom's version, yes. He described a struggle for the bat, Jason shoving him. Tom said he then rushed Jason. They both had hands on the bat for a moment, and Tom managed to hit Jason with the end of the bat, regaining full control.
And then?
Then, Tom testified, he hit Jason again and again until Jason finally went down. And Tom believed Jason could no longer get up and hurt them. That was his justification for the number of blows.
So that's the core of the self-defense narrative. A father intervening in a violent assault on his daughter, a struggle, escalating force until the threat was stopped.
That was the story presented by the defense, yes.
But as we've already touched on, the sources highlight a lot of things that seem to contradict that story, or at least raise serious questions.
Definitely. A number of key points challenge that narrative.
Like what? What were the immediate observations at the scene?
Well, first responders, people like paramedic David Dillard and Lieutenant Frank Young, they observed Molly at the scene. They noted she was rubbing or tugging at her neck, making crying sounds.
Okay, consistent with being choked.
Maybe. But here's the thing. Multiple witnesses, including these experienced professionals, specifically mentioned they didn't see any actual visible tears.
No tears, despite supposedly just surviving a life or death struggle and witnessing her husband's violent death.
That observation was noted in the sources, yes. And it goes further. Lieutenant Young took photographs of both Molly and Tom later that morning.
And those photos showed.
According to the sources detailing trial evidence, the photos showed no visible injuries on Molly's neck. No marks consistent with strangulation. No injuries on her hands either.
Nothing.
Nothing obvious in the photos presented. And similarly for Tom Martens, no visible injuries on his face, hands, or body. His glasses weren't broken. His shirt wasn't torn.
Despite claiming a physical struggle for a baseball bat.
Right. Now, they did suspect some blood might have been on Tom's shirt, his watch, under his fingernails, but no signs of him being injured in the fight he described. Paramedics noted some redness on Molly's neck, but no other apparent injuries on either of them.
That lack of corresponding injuries on them is, well, it's a major inconsistency with their account of a violent hands-on fight.
It's certainly a point the prosecution hammered home, based on the sources.
Okay, what about the brick? You mentioned their explanation.
Ah, yes, the brick. The story was that Molly and the kids were going to paint it, like a craft project for garden decoration. That's why it was supposedly on the nightstand.
And how did that explanation go over?
Sources suggest many people found it questionable. Why just one single paver stone? Why keep it on a nightstand in the master bedroom? Where were the paints, the brushes? None of that was there.
Doesn't really add up.
And critically, forensic testing found hair on that brick, hair that was consistent with Jason Corbett's.
So the physical evidence directly links the brick to the assault, not to some innocent craft project.
Correct. That connection was made clear.
Now, perhaps the most significant challenge to the defense narrative involves the children, Jack and Sarah.
Yes, this is a really difficult and crucial part of the case, as the sources lay out. Jack was 11, Sarah was 8. They were in the house that night.
And initially, their statements seemed to support Molly and Tom.
They did. In interviews shortly after the event, conducted by social services and at a child advocacy center, both children described Jason as being verbally and physically abusive.
Yeah.
They talked about relationship problems between Jason and Molly.
So their initial accounts lined up with the idea that Jason could be violent.
Exactly. Those statements were obviously very helpful to the defense case.
But their story changed.
Yeah.
Dramatically.
Years later, yes. When Jack was 18 and Sarah was 20, they both came forward and stated that Molly had coached them.
Coached them.
Yes. They said Molly told them what to say, pressured them into lying about their father being abusive, all to protect her and Tom.
Wow. They explicitly said they were told to lie.
That's what their later testimony and statements indicated, according to multiple sources. And investigators had apparently noted early on that the specific language that children use in those initial interviews, phrases like verbally and physically abusive, sounded unusually sophisticated for kids their age.
Suggesting the words weren't entirely their own.
It certainly raised red flags, suggesting potential coaching, even back then.
So the children's eventual recantation, saying they were forced to lie, That completely undermines the foundation of the defense narrative about Jason's alleged abusiveness that night.
It really does. It suggests a deliberate attempt right from the start to create a false narrative to justify the killing.
And Sarah, Jason's daughter, has been quite vocal recently.
Extremely. She wrote a book, participated in the Netflix documentary, and she's made another really startling claim based on what she says Molly told her.
What's that?
Sarah believes her father's murder was actually recorded.
Recorded?
She claims there was some kind of listening device on the nightstand in the bedroom. She says Molly essentially confirmed this in the documentary. Her brother Jack also reported seeing such a device in a Ziploc bag being handled by investigators after the murder.
The listening device potentially recording the entire event.
If true, the implications are huge. Sources discussing this point out it raises serious questions about premeditation. Was this a spontaneous event or something planned, maybe even documented?
Okay, so let's recap the contradictions the sources highlight. The brutal forensic evidence suggesting overkill and a post-mortem blow, the lack of injuries on Molly and Tom inconsistent with their story, the highly questionable explanation for the brick, the children's later statements about being coached to lie about abuse, and now this possibility of a recording device.
Taken together, these points paint a picture that is very, very different from the self-defense claim. They cast significant doubt on that entire narrative.
So how did all of this play out in the legal system? It sounds like a prosecution slam dunk, but we know it wasn't that simple.
No, it definitely wasn't straightforward. The legal journey was complex. The first trial was held in 2017.
And the verdict then?
Both Molly Martens and Thomas Martens were found guilty of second-degree murder.
Guilty of murder. What was the sentence?
They each received a sentence of 20 to 25 years in prison.
Okay. A significant conviction and sentence. But that wasn't the end of the road.
Not even close.
No.
In 2020, the North Carolina Court of Appeals reviewed the case, and in a 2-to-1 decision, they overturned the murder convictions.
Overturned. Why? What were the grounds for throwing out a murder conviction like that?
The appeals court decision, based on the sources, focused on several specific legal issues, basically errors they believed occurred during the first trial regarding evidence and jury instructions.
Okay, like what specifically?
One major point was the exclusion of the children's initial statements, the ones where they described Jason as abusive.
Even though they later said they were coached.
Right. The appeals court ruled that those initial statements made to social services and the Child Advocacy Center interviewers should have been allowed as evidence for the defense to present. They reasoned the statements could have been relevant to the Martens' claims about Jason's behavior and their state of mind, especially since the children had received diagnoses related to abuse exposure.
So the court felt the jury should have heard those initial claims regardless of the later recantation. That's a complex legal point.
It is. Another issue was the bloodstain pattern analysis testimony from Stuart James.
The testimony that seems so damning about being hit while down.
Yes. The Court of Appeals questioned the reliability of some aspects of his testimony, specifically regarding conclusions drawn from untested stains on clothing, like Tom Martens' boxers. They questioned whether his scientific methodology was applied reliably enough in this specific instance to support the conclusion about blows being struck while Jason was already on the floor.
So the expert evidence itself was challenged on appeal.
Certain aspects of it, yes. The court also found fault with the trial judge, excluding testimony from Tom Martens about Molly allegedly yelling, "Don't hurt my dad," during the incident.
Why was that exclusion considered an error?
The appeals court said that statement could have been relevant to Tom's subjective belief that he needed to use deadly force to protect himself or Molly, so it should have been admitted.
Okay. Any other grounds?
Finally, the court found that the trial judge's instructions to the jury regarding something called the aggressor doctrine were not sufficiently supported by the evidence presented at trial. This doctrine deals with whether someone who starts a fight can later claim self-defense. The appeals court ruled this was a reversible error for Tom Martens and likely prejudiced Molly Martens as well.
So a combination of issues. Excluded evidence that might have helped the defense, questions about expert testimony reliability, and flawed jury instructions.
That's the gist of why the convictions were overturned and a new trial was ordered.
So they were facing a completely new murder trial. What happened next?
Faced with the prospect of going through another lengthy and potentially unpredictable trial, Molly and Thomas Martens chose a different path. In November 2023, they accepted plea deals.
A plea deal, so they didn't go to retrial. What did they plead guilty to?
They both pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter.
Voluntary manslaughter, not murder.
Correct. Sources explain voluntary manslaughter often applies to killings that happen in the heat of passion or during a fight, without the premeditation required for murder. This plea deal allowed them to admit guilt to this reduced charge, and importantly, it allowed them to present their full side of the story and mitigating evidence during the sentencing hearing.
So they got to tell their version again at sentencing. And what was the judge's decision then?
After hearing arguments from both sides, including testimony related to self-defense claims and mitigating factors, the judge decided that a sentence in the mitigated range was appropriate.
Mitigated range, meaning less than the standard sentence.
Yes, below the typical presumptive sentence range for voluntary manslaughter in North Carolina.
And what did that mitigated sentence mean in practical terms, given the time they'd already served?
It meant their release was imminent. They had already served about 4 years and 3 months since their original conviction in 2017.
So the sentence was essentially time served or very close to it?
Effectively, yes.
Right.
Based on the judge's ruling and the time they'd already spent incarcerated, they were released from prison in 2024.
Wow. From second-degree murder convictions and 20-plus-year sentences to an overturned conviction, a plea to voluntary manslaughter, and release after just over 4 years, that's quite a legal journey.
It really is a very dramatic turnaround in the legal outcome.
What's been the aftermath since their release? What are the sources saying?
Well, sources reported on statements Molly Martens made upon release. She expressed gratitude for being alive, and interestingly, she referenced past abusive relationships.
Yeah.
She thanked women who had testified about abuse, thanked the DSS and Child Advocacy Center for preserving the children's initial testimony, the very testimony the appeals court said should have been admitted.
Right.
And perhaps most surprisingly, she thanked the legal system. The system that first convicted her for granting the new trial, allowing the plea deal, and giving her that mitigated sentence.
Thankful for the system.
Yeah.
That's quite a perspective, given everything. What about Jason's children, Jack and Sarah? Where are they now?
After the initial trial, they returned to Ireland. They live there now, under the legal guardianship of Jason's sister, Tracey, and her husband, David.
So they're with family in Ireland?
Yes. Although sources, particularly statements from Sarah and her guardians, mention that Molly has continued to try and contact them via social media. Sarah has described it as a constant barrage of messages.
It must be incredibly difficult for them still dealing with that.
Unimaginably so.
And as you mentioned, this case is back in the public eye because of recent media.
Yes. The Netflix documentary A Deadly American Marriage came out just recently in May 2025. It apparently presents different viewpoints, including interviews with the Martens family.
And Sarah's book.
Sarah Corbett Lynch's book, A Time for Truth, was released earlier this year, February 2025. She's been clear that her purpose in writing it and participating in the documentary was to share her truth, her perspective on her father, and what happened.
It's really striking that the children, whose voices were initially contested and possibly manipulated, are now adults sharing their own accounts.
It adds another powerful layer to the whole story.
How is this case being discussed more broadly now, online or in commentary, based on the sources?
Well, online discussions often circle back to those core inconsistencies we talked about, the brick story, the coaching allegations. There's still a lot of debate about Molly Martens' actions and potential manipulation.
People questioning the self-defense claim versus premeditation.
Exactly. And many sources reflect a strong public reaction, a feeling that the final legal outcome, voluntary manslaughter, relatively short time served, feels like an injustice, especially compared to the brutality of the crime and the initial murder conviction.
Is there talk of other legal action?
There is mention in some sources of the possibility of a civil lawsuit, a wrongful death suit brought by Jason's children, by his estate, against Molly and Thomas Martens. That's separate from the criminal case, seeking monetary damages.
So the legal battles might not even be fully over yet.
Potentially not. But the core conflict remains, as the sources present it. Was this a terrible but understandable act of self-defense against a man who snapped? Or was it a calculated, brutal murder followed by an elaborate cover-up involving coached children and manipulated evidence?
The criminal legal system ultimately landed on voluntary manslaughter via the plea deal. But it's clear that hasn't settled the narrative for everyone involved or for the public watching.
No, not at all. The plea deal provided legal resolution for the Martens in the criminal courts, but the conflicting stories and the quest for a definitive truth are ongoing.
So we followed this story from that horrific scene in the bedroom,
through the complex forensic evidence, the bloodstains, the autopsy findings,
through the completely opposing narratives offered by the defense and the evidence challenging it.
the really tragic involvement of the children and their changing accounts.
And finally, through the twists and turns of the legal system, conviction, appeal, plea deal, and release after just over 4 years served.
It's a case that really forces you to look at how we interpret evidence, how narratives are constructed, especially in traumatic situations, and how the legal process tries to navigate these incredibly deep divides and contested facts.
It leaves you with a heavy question, doesn't it? When you have such extreme violence, such brutal facts, but also these starkly conflicting accounts of self-defense versus homicide, how do we really draw that line? And maybe more pointedly, what does the final outcome here? The plea deal for voluntary manslaughter, the relatively short time served, tell us about the pursuit of truth and the meaning of justice in the face of such profound loss and violence. It's something to really think about after hearing all the details this source